Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So we've ended quiet February. Welcome back to a full regular Sunday, practice Sunday. So if I were to ask practitioners in this country what Sotoshu does, what it's engaged in, most folks, I'm guessing, probably wouldn't have any idea. Some might say, well, it does Zazen, it does big ceremonies. These tend to be the things we think about. Few people might know about administrative functions because here we're always registering something. We're registering an ongo. We're registering that we've ordained somebody, someone's had Dharma transmission, right? When you consider that Sotoshu is a denomination, you might guess some other things because typically there are about three things that a denomination does. There's a religious function, which is about sort of defining, interpreting what doctrine means for that particular group, what the central tenets mean. There's something there about managing clergy, training, credentialing, taking care of, making sure we know where they are, what they're doing, managing the clergy. And there's a piece about facilitating sort of a shared mission, shared activities toward whatever the objectives, right, of the group are. Then there's an organizational function, which is oversight and accountability for local churches, in our case temples, and the clergy that function in the temples. There's also some legal structure there for churches and congregations, or in our case, temples and sanghas, right? There are IRS requirements about what a denomination looks like, for instance, in this country. It takes 5 years to become a denomination. You have to do certain things. You have to look like certain things. Finally, there's an identity function, and this is doing the discernment around what distinguishes our faith tradition, our sect, our practice, our spiritual life from other groups like ours, or within a broader religious tradition, what is our particular focus? So within the Buddhist tradition, within the Zen tradition, what is our particular focus? Is Sotoshu. So those three are typically what a denomination is about. So in January, I talked about Sotoshu history, denominational history, very broadly. That information, by the way, is out on Sanshin source if you want to review it or you missed it. So in that talk, we heard a little bit about each of those three areas. There were things going on in each of those three areas. And that's helpful so we have some context, but what does that actually look like on the ground today? So it might seem like Sotoshu is mainly an archive or a fossilized system that mainly looks backwards because, as we heard, it feels really responsible for instance, curating Dogen's legacy. There seems to be a lot of looking backward and saying, where did we come from and what do we look backward to as our guiding principles, right, our house rules. So it can feel like, well, that's all it's doing. It's a backward-looking organization because, heck, we're still wearing, 800-year-old robes and doing things that we've been doing for centuries, and it can feel a little bit like it's stuck in the past. So actually, not the case. There are elements of that, right? But you might be surprised by some of the ways and means that Sotoshu uses to do the work that it's trying to do, and also who's engaged in those activities. It's not just people wearing gold robes or brown robes, right? So again, just like last time, we can't possibly mention in less than an hour all the things, right, that Sotoshu is engaged in. There is an org chart for Sotoshu. I've posted it on source. You can go look in the World of Soto Zen section. You can see it's quite a complex org chart. The first time I saw it some years ago, I was really surprised. It looks like a huge multinational corporation because it kind of is, right? It's got departments for stuff that surprised me. I thought, well, that's really interesting. There's a lot more going on here than I understood. So I'm going to highlight a few things today. Just know this is not the whole story. Right? Please dig in if you're interested in any of these things and find out more. So the Sotoshu org chart has about 8 layers. It starts with the corporate leaders at the top. This is why I say it looks like a multinational, right? Corporate leaders at the top. It goes down through various divisions, various departments, to the bottom layer, which is individual temples and clergy and temple families. So it's going from the biggest down to the most individual. So I'm going to look today mostly at the 7th layer, which is just one layer above local temples, which is the equivalent of us, right? The equivalent of Sanshin. So that 7th layer includes, for instance, the Young Priests Association, the Women's Association, the Child Care Association, the Chaplains Association, the Probation Officers Association, like who knew, right? activities for Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. We'll talk a bit about that. Social welfare facilities. Sotoshu is also affiliated with a number of schools, starting with kindergarten, going all the way up through universities and grad school. So there's a lot going on there. If we just think Sotoshu is an administrative office, or that it's only all about the Zazen, we can miss a lot. So if we put those structures next to the main sort of outreach areas or project that Sotoshu has identified for itself, we can see some efforts to help everyday people integrate teachings and practice into their lives. So there are things like, yes, teaching Zazen, holding Zazen Kai, doing sutra copying events, right? Sermons, Dharma teaching, helping families with memorials and funerals, and all those things that you would expect. But it's also talking about Zen and work, for instance. How do we take Zen to work, or how do we think about Zen and work? Being aware of polite behavior, deportment. How are we being with other humans in the world, right? Paying attention to those small everyday activities like brushing your teeth, washing your face. We encounter those things in the training temple, but of course, bigger than the training temple, right? Food practice. There's a whole effort around food practice. Does that sound familiar? We just spent, half of a year last year talking about food practice. Lots of activities around food practice. Why? Everybody cooks and eats, right? So monks actually give cooking classes about the vegetarian cuisine in temples. These things sell out. They seem to be really popular. So the intersection of food and practice, food and zazen, food and dharma, right? Something which is a big dharma gate for people. So there are also opportunities for cultural events, learning about Ryokan, his life and poems, hearing traditional music, engaging with storytelling, some of the things that we've started to talk about here, right? So those efforts, of course, are primarily aimed at Japanese people in Japan, so we may not hear about them so much. We might not be aware of them. Our main activities or our interactions here with Sotoshu tend to be ceremonial or administrative, right? So there have been attempts to create resources for the international community over the years. There used to be, for instance, an English language, like a little magazine, came out, I don't know, several times a year. Things that were made available to practitioners in North America and around the world. Resources are shrinking. It's been very, very difficult to keep that up, right? So the focus these days is really sort of turning back inward to taking care of Japan itself, taking care of the Japanese itself. It's not that what we're doing is not important. It's that resources are limited. So guess what, folks? It's time for us to grow up and begin to take care of ourselves, which we are. So there are some external forces at work on Sotoshu. It's having to figure out how to respond. So just like any human organization, there are threats and opportunities internally and threats and opportunities externally. Sotoshu is dealing with three big things that are happening in the Japanese social world: declining birth rate, aging population, increasing population mobility. So that means it's more important than ever for Sotoshu and its temples to connect with everyday people in a relevant way, so that everyday people can practice, right? If your people are moving around, or if there are fewer of them, your budget is not so healthy, right? So it's really important now to connect with people who are practicing. If your congregation, your danka, starts to shrink or move away or die off, or there aren't so many anymore, there goes your financial support, right? So there's a cycle that's happening there. But in addition to the efforts aimed at partnering with local temples, Sotoshu has several initiatives that are just sort of in the world. For example, 2 weeks from yesterday, there's a national prayer gathering or a memorial for people who've died by suicide. This is a big issue. There were more than 20,000 such people in 2024. Mostly or frequently, not mostly, frequently middle-aged men. But at the moment, the rate among school children is at an all-time high. So this is a real social problem, right, that Sotoshu is trying to provide, for which Sotoshu is trying to provide some support. So the denomination is responding as part of a longer, sort of larger national effort to raise awareness. In April and May, Sotoshu is holding its 60th annual calligraphy exhibition by students in primary and middle school. So these are young young students, right? It's been doing this for 60 years. This is part of their youth education, right? Developing religious understanding and sensibility. So the theme generally for Sotoshu's mission work at the moment is living with sincerity. So they've taken this as the theme for this calligraphy exhibition and competition. And the calligraphy that these students are asked to write focus on impermanence, interconnectedness, compassion, right? Things that feel very familiar to us. There are also opportunities for scout groups to come to the two main temples for weekends at a time and earn their badges in Buddhism. So I don't know if any of us here were Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts and you were earning badges in things. If you're in Japan and you're a scout, you can actually earn a badge in Buddhism or in Soto Zen, right? In order to get your badge, you have to know 10 things. Here's the 10 things. Now imagine, these are young people, and here's what they have to know. They have to be able to speak about the biography and the teachings of the Buddha. They have to know the significance of the Buddhist flag. Have we ever seen the Buddhist flag? There's a Buddhist flag. They have to know the significance of the flag and the emblems, the religious emblems, right? They have to know the name of the Soto sect and the name and location of the head temples and the principal image and the names of the two ancestors, right? So we've talked here about Ichibutsu Ryoso, one Buddha, two founders. They have to know who these people are. They have to be able to give an outline of the doctrines of the Soto sect, right? They have to be able to speak about the biographies of the two ancestors, Dogen and Keizan. They have to know the significance of Soto sect events. They have to know and to be able to perform the proper manners for worship. We would call those forms, right? They have to know the forms. They have to know how to decorate a Buddhist altar, how to be able to perform religious services at home, because most homes have a butsudan, right? You have to be able to do that. You have to be able to sing Buddhist hymns, so they're getting some training in Baika. They have to submit a record of practicing a life of gratitude and appreciation. So there's some essays they have to write. And I think, if I remember correctly, you get your choice of either faith, you have to write about faith, or about what in the environment means to me. So they're doing like volunteer, thinking about something larger in the environment, right? Lastly, they have to serve in the local community and at sect temple events based on the teachings of Soto Zen and submit a record of that. So they have to be doing service in the community, right? So imagine, that's a lot for young people. And imagine going to the head temples or to your local temple and learning to do that. So there are probably a lot of adults who don't know all that stuff. I mean, if I gave you that list, how well would we all do, right? So this is one way to reach out to the next generation, right? Establish some practice connection. If we're concerned about where our next generation of practitioners and temple supporters are coming from, it makes a lot of sense. We would be engaged with young people at schools and through scout groups and calligraphy and other things. So here's an initiative I really love. When I heard about this, I had to smile, which is ironic because it's called the Smile Gathering, right? So this is held by the Temple Successor Counseling Center, and yes, there is such a thing within Soto Zen. Why? Because just like here, there are so many temples that don't have somebody who's ready to take over. And if the population is aging, then the clergy are aging, and who's coming along after them, right? So that the temple isn't just empty, a blue sky temple, right? So succession is a thing. Sotoshu doesn't want to lose all those temples, wants to make sure that there's still practice and help available to people. So there's this thing called the Smile Gathering. It is for those who want to connect with monks. Now, what do you think this is about? This is aimed at 4 groups. 2 male groups and 2 female groups. Group A priest seeking a spouse with the hope of becoming the successor of his spouse's family temple. So if you are a clergy and you are not from a temple family, you're looking for a place to serve. Maybe you marry a woman who has a temple family and they need a successor. Group B is the women, the daughter of a temple family seeking a spouse who will become the priest and take over the temple, right? Group C is male, priest seeking a relationship with a woman, and Group D, a woman seeking a relationship with a priest. So if you just happen to like the clergy and you want to find one for yourself, right? So if you've got to run a denominational dating service, that's what you got to do. I love that. I think it just cracks me up. So on Source, I put an image of their poster. There's a lovely little poster they have for the Smile Gathering, right? Are you surprised? I was. The surprising scope of this denomination. So a couple of other examples of things Sotoshu is doing is an outreach to normal, everyday people. Lots of publications, there are myriad publications, newsletters, magazines, booklets about stuff. books and booklets about stuff, aimed usually at a particular audience, or they're about a particular thing. So not surprisingly, we have the Dogen Institute. Sotoshu does lots of publications. In 2006, they stopped committing these things to paper, really, and started posting them on the internet, either for download or for reading. Paper is expensive for the same reason that DI stuff is mainly ebooks now, right? Resources are shrinking. If you can read Japanese, you can see a lot of these things online, right? Or you have a browser that will translate, you can see some of these things online. There are sermon podcasts, there are YouTube videos, there are online classes, there are Zazen periods, right? They're doing all the stuff that you might expect. Young Priests Association even sent a film to the Cannes Film Festival, I think in roughly 2019, sometime before the pandemic. And they were talking about, or the thing was about, I think, recovery from the tsunami and earthquake. So they're using all the vehicles, all the communication vehicles there are. I was really quite surprised to find Sotoshu actually has 3 free apps available. There's an app for that, right? One is a sutra book. One is a journal for recording your feelings and improving your mental state. So you record your feelings, and then you get some counseling or words of wisdom or something, right? Third one is for practicing baika, or for hymn singing, right? So they've got apps out there on Google Play and Apple Store. So there's certainly no fear here of embracing technology. This is not entirely an organization that's stuck 800 years ago, right? There's no fear of figuring out what are people paying attention to and how are they getting their information, right? So maybe Sanshin needs to make some apps. So this is, of course, all about reaching people where they are, right? We can also, of course, see the effects of these shrinking financial resources. Publications are expensive. Putting something online is maybe less expensive, right? How do we make best use of shrinking resources and still get the Dharma to people? So the other one I was going to mention, of course, baika singing, our hymn singing tradition with the handbells, aimed at both sharing teachings, because what we're singing is Dharma teaching. The lyrics are all about Dogen and his teachings and Buddhist teachings in general. And also creating fellowship opportunities, encouraging people to visit the temple, sing in the group. So folks, when they're going to the temple with a baika-related event, they're not necessarily going to hear a concert. They're going to practice with their singing group and maybe sing at temple events, right? So there's a lot of fellowship. When I was in Japan and doing baika, we would sing for a while, but then, and it was almost all, nice ladies in these groups, but somebody had brought tea and somebody had brought cakes, and there was always a break in the middle, and it was, someone had lost their husband, and how are you doing, and right, there was a lot of fellowship and support. So it was really as much about that as it was about the singing. So we can look at all of that as a laundry list of activities and projects and events and think, well, why do we care? That's great for them. Right? Why is Hoko telling us all this stuff? Here's what I take from seeing what Sotoshu as a denomination that's been around for a long time is doing. I look at that and I say, this is not Zen as a weekend hobby. This is not Zen as a self-help program, a personal sort of spiritual quest. This is not Zen as a competitive sport or a philosophical debate. This is Soto Zen completely integrated into people's lives from the time they're kindergartners all the way up until they're senior citizens, right? It's for everyone. It's not for only superheroes or samurai or Buddhas or tough people in the Zendo sitting really hardcore sesshin. This is about how do we sort of live moment by moment, and not just the grown-ups, but also the kids. And just how do we make this our moment-by-moment frame? So the temple is where you run into your friends. Or maybe your kids are hanging out there because there's an after-school program, or you're going there for a neighborhood event. It's part of, the temple is a well-established part of the overall community. It's not something separate that you just go to as a hobby on a weekend. So in July, we're going to look more closely at the relationship between temples and laity, but we begin to see how that relationship works, right? So Sotoshu is also active in 3 what I would call outward-facing areas: human rights, peace work, and the environment. So we might think this sort of thing is only happening in North America because somehow we're more up to date and we're more engaged with society and we're not an 800-year-old group carrying a venerable tradition, right? Clergy and laity are working on projects both inside and outside of Japan in all three of these areas. So for instance, for several years, you may know, Sotoshu's been talking a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They've been providing guidance for people at home. How do we engage with these things, right? How can lay practitioners make a difference for clean water or gender equality or reducing poverty or what, all those 17 things. In the everyday things that they're doing at home. So sometimes if you go to a conference or you see a lot of clergy together, you'll see some of them wearing little SDG pins on their rakusu, right? So this is a commitment. It's a big commitment. So taking each of these three areas in turn to see what are they doing, what is Soto Zen's engagement with each of these things, starting with human rights. Again, under that, three broad areas in which they're working, because basically, historically, the Soto Zen denomination has been part of the problem, which is really interesting. So Sotoshu says, our efforts to eliminate social discrimination and establish human rights have an important meaning. We are inheriting the teachings of the Buddha and his two ancestors on human equality. The Buddha who founded Buddhism and the two ancestors of our Soto sect, Zen Master Dogen and Zen Master Keizan, preached the teachings of human equality based on the spirit of wisdom and compassion. Sounds pretty modern, right? So then it goes on to give one quote each from the Buddha and each of the founders. So from the Sutta Nipata, what is given as a given name or surname in this world is merely a title. We'll see why that's important in a minute. Shobogenzo, do not look at one's lineage. Denkoroku, the four surnames should not be used to distinguish between people, for they are all the same. So this thing about discrimination by names is a certain piece of Japanese history. It comes from a certain piece of Japanese history. In feudal days, there was a class system where people were born into a certain area, had a lower status. This is complicated. You can read about it. I'm simplifying, right? They had a certain kind of lower status. That system was abolished in 1871, but somehow the discrimination has gone on because human beings are human beings, right? It shows up in things like employment or choosing marriage partners. So if you're applying for a job or you want to get married, there's a background check on you. Somebody goes and looks up your family records and your own records. Those are often government records, but sometimes they have been temple death records because they say something about who your family is or was, right? So there have been accusations that the main purpose of that research was simply to determine whether somebody was from this lower class group. And that was the whole point of all of that. Sotoshu says it's now refusing to participate in background checks and campaigning against those things in general for that kind of use, right? So the second human rights area is discrimination against people with leprosy or Hansen's disease. It's a condition or a disease that breaks out during hard times like war or famine or something, which are not actually happening today. At the turn of the century, a series of sanatoriums were established, and anybody who was suffering with this disease was required to go there. So no matter where you were living, and some people were living in temples and shrines and stuff, right? No matter where you were living, what shape you were in, if you had this disease, you were required to go there. And it's that kind of forcible isolation fed into this discriminative sort of thing, even after people were cured, even after people were okay. It went on all the way up until 1996. So this, again, was a big social issue. So the places where these patients had lived before they went to the sanitarium, and everything they had touched or used was disinfected in a really, really harsh way. And again, perpetuates this idea that this is a terrible infectious disease, that these people are really a danger to you, we really need to separate ourselves from them, right? Actually, my understanding is that that disease mechanism is fairly weak, but the impression was created that these are terrible people with a terrible disease. So on top of that, some religious leaders were teaching that people who had, that this disease was a karmic retribution. If you came down with this disease, it was because you'd done some terrible thing in this life or your past life, right? So all about the evil deeds. And again, we have this separation, we have this discrimination. These are bad people, they did something bad, they have this terrible disease which you don't want to get, right? So in June 2001, Sotoshu starts apologizing to the patients for whatever part they may have played in spreading this kind of discriminative thing, and working to restore their human rights. So that includes repentance services and educational materials and training sessions and sanatorium visits, right? At one place where I was training, they packed a bunch of us off for the day to learn about these discrimination issues, and it went over my head because I didn't understand the background, and of course it was all in Japanese. And there wasn't anybody who was going to explain that to me. Years later, now I understand why they were doing that. It's something that's still being talked about. Third area of human rights work is in returning the remains of Korean laborers who were brought to Japan during World War II to their families. So either these folks were forcibly deported and conscripted, or they were employed by Japanese companies. Somehow they died in Japan in the course of their work there. So there was an agreement in December 2004 to cooperate. Sotoshu was going to cooperate in finding and returning these remains, not only of the military personnel, but civilian employees from Korea. This took a lot of soul searching. It resulted in a lot of soul searching within Sotoshu, reconsidering its own involvement in war and aggression and colonial rule. How is it willingly or unwillingly perpetuating, participating, right? So again, it started to issue letters of apology and doing repentance. Now it's working with temples where those remains are buried and with the bereaved families to find these remains and identify them and return them to their families and to their home temples, right? So for example, 1943 and 44, up in Hokkaido, there were 2 military airfields built using this Korean forced labor. Those who died there as a part of that work, doing that work, were buried in a communal cemetery at the airfield. And after the war, a new communal cemetery was built, and somehow all the Japanese graves got moved into this wonderful new communal cemetery, and the Korean graves were left behind. So now there's something of an excavation project going on to find these folks and identify them, and those remains, when they're found, are temporarily being cared for in the Soto Zen temple in that town. The point is, treat the Japanese people buried at the temple and the Korean people buried at the airfield the same way, same level of respect, right? So the words they actually use are, we see this as an extremely religious undertaking, right? So in addition, I was interested to see they've started a Korea-Japan Zen Club, where once a year there's some joint activities between Korean Zen clergy and Soto Zen clergy. They get together and do zazen and do some things, right? So again, there's some connection trying to be made between these countries, which historically have had suffering. There's been differences. So that's the human rights element. Next element, working for peace. So interestingly, I was very interested to find some years ago, Sotoshu's interaction with international temples, overseas activities like us, come under the heading of peace work for them. We're part of their peace initiative, right? That there are overseas temples and overseas teachers teaching the Dharma. So Sotoshu's missionary goal, again, living with sincerity. So how do we bring living with sincerity out into the world? So also in 1980, Sotoshu established a volunteer association, today it's called Shanti, to work in Cambodian refugee camps in Thailand. These were camps that were sheltering hundreds of thousands of people that were fleeing from Khmer Rouge genocide, Vietnamese invasion, right? So Shanti's focus now is on improving literacy and education, and they're working all around Southeast Asia, Afghanistan, Nepal. At the moment, I think they're also raising money for Ukraine. So they're looking quite broadly. They're building schools, they're distributing books, they're training teachers and librarians, right? It's a huge effort. So the underlying doctrines around peace work at Sotoshu, again, of course, are teachings of Buddha and Dogen and Keizan about how do we build a society which is free from conflict and filled with compassion. So in 1992, Sotoshu issues another, letter of apology for its involvement in past invasions and colonial rule, and this letter says, in part, we pledge never to make the same mistake again. Vow and repentance, right? No one, no matter how many people they may be, should be allowed to invade should be allowed to invade or persecute others. This is because people exist on the earth as irreplaceable beings. This applies to nations and peoples alike. If we reflect, even before World War II, our sect has a shameful history of repeatedly glorifying war and preaching in various ways, both at home and abroad, which has led to hurtful messages to people in other countries. We hereby repent once more and join with you in our determination not to repeat such mistakes. From the standpoint of non-aggression, the Soto sect asserts that war is a wrong for everyone. So it's interesting, I think, that in both the human rights and the peace work, the starting point seems to have been the need for reflection. Coming to terms with Sotoshu's own involvement in these issues and in these problems, right? So it's not just saying, well, war is bad. They've just said war is bad for everybody. But they're not just saying war is bad or discrimination is wrong, right? There's at least some attempt to take ownership of past mistakes, not just telling other people what to do based on here's what Dogen says, here's what Buddha says, right? Here's what Keisan says. So how much of that is performative? Who knows? Are we virtue signaling? I don't know. But even so, it's useful to think about. This is vow and repentance on a huge scale. And how might we just consider that? So finally, environmental work. Activities in two areas, litter pickup and energy conservation. So these, again, based on teachings about interconnectedness, everything connected with supporting everything else. And again, the approach is to promote practical things that people can do, practitioners can do, practical ways of living that protect the environment. So you are not necessarily going to see complex discussions of global change, climate change, right? You're not necessarily going to see that. You're going to see tips for conserving water at home when you're washing the dishes and taking a bath. And yay, because that's practice too, right? These are things individual practitioners can do on a daily basis. For example, there is a big effort being organized to pick up litter, pick up trash, across the 14,000 Soto Zen temples in Japan, which is 1.7 million adherents. They're organizing through social media, right? And they're having litter pickup days. So, you know, this too is practice, right? On the energy conservation side, working on energy conservation, again, they're suggesting things people can do at home. Manage the heat, manage the temperature in your house, heating and cooling, plant greenery, put up solar panels, use LED light bulbs, turn off the lights in the computers and whatnot when you're not using them. And it says, by the way, we're doing these things in our offices. We're making sure we turn off our computer monitors when we're not using them, right? They're trying to walk the talk a bit. So human rights, peace work, environment. So given Japan's geography and geology, of course, there's also a lot of partnership on earthquake relief. We've had big earthquakes, you know, recently, but it goes back a long way. So there's material support, food, blankets, medical care, right? There's also psychological support. And this is kind of interesting because there's a sort of a distrust of religion in certain ways, and certainly a stigma around therapy. So, interestingly, Young Priests Association holds monk cafes. Now, maybe you've heard or read about the monk cafes. They were particularly visible after the Great Kanto earthquake and tsunami, right? So these cafes are places where people can come, they can hang out, they can drink coffee, they can eat cake, maybe listen to some music, and start to talk about what's going on with them, right? How are we feeling? How are we doing? Monks are simply there to listen and provide some warmth and compassion and normalcy in cases where, I mean, sometimes these folks have lost everything. They're living in sort of temporary housing because they've literally lost everything, like their belongings and their family members. I mean, that was a tough, tough time. So monks are out there simply to listen, and it works because there isn't the stigma of going to a therapist, right, or engaging in a government program. You're simply going down the street, have a cup of coffee, have a piece of cake, talk with people, other people. So these cafes are not about overtly preaching, converting people, teaching the Dharma. They're not about that. It's there because, you know, it's there. But these are not places which are filled with here's information, here's instructions, here's what you need to do next. It's simply a place you can sort of let down a little bit, right? So today there are also monk bars, there are monk restaurants, other things aimed at indirectly bringing the Dharma to people in the community where they are who are suffering. So out on Sanshin Source, I've linked some information about some of those. There's some English articles you can read about how that's working. It's been quite successful. So again, all this is great. Why do we care in North America? We don't have tsunamis. We're not doing monk cafes, at least not yet. Like, why do we care about the human rights and the peace work and all that? So again, here's what I take from understanding the overall scale and scope of what Sotoshu is doing. These activities are all gateways into the Dharma or into practice, going inward, and outwardly opportunities to make them real. Make those things real in the world. So looking inward, we have kids participating in calligraphy, and they're writing about interconnectedness and compassion, right? We have scout troops learning about Buddhism in order to get a badge. We have older ladies singing in Baika groups. We have people thoughtfully preparing their meals at home, right? These are all seeing, hearing, internalizing Buddhist teaching and working with it in a kind of a concrete, direct way. So in addition to being able to hear a sermon podcast, copy a sutra, join a zazen kai, right? You can pick up litter with your neighbors in your neighborhood. You don't have to sit a hardcore sesshin. You don't have to be an intellectual Buddhist scholar, right? You don't have to do that stuff. You can engage with the three treasures by stringing prayer beads and making a mala, or downloading a coloring book for your kids. So that's the inward. Facing outward, we've got people running monk cafes, volunteers working on mobile libraries, people working with the Hansen's disease patients. They're all making Buddhist teaching real in the world for themselves as well as for others in a really visible, concrete, public, communal way. I'm not here to be an apologist for Sotoshu. I'm not here to say Sotoshu doesn't have issues and hasn't made mistakes, because of course it has issues, it's made mistakes. It's a human organization, and it's a big human organization. And it functions in ways that we here don't always understand because it's embedded in its culture. It has a particular history. Its karma has played out in certain ways. My guess is that there's a lot of what I just said that you've never heard before, especially the things perhaps related very specifically to Japanese history. We're not dealing with those circumstances. We're not dealing with Hansen's disease patients, and we're not dealing with a tsunami. But my guess is most North American practitioners probably think that we invented chaplaincy, or that somehow we added that into the world of Soto Zen where it was not before, or that we invented community partnerships or children's practice or meeting people where they are. We probably think we're the only ones dealing with pushback from a secular society. We may think we're the only ones dealing with the challenges of intersecting technology and practice, because we have a certain idea about what the denomination is and who we think we are, right? So the human rights issues we face in North America are not the same as the human rights issues faced in Japan, but we're all dealing with this need to not look away from suffering. What's the human rights issue in front of us? There are also human rights issues in Japan. The reasons that we or our practice might be seen as irrelevant, or that religious practice might be seen as irrelevant, or that we don't have as much participation in temple activities as we might like, are different in Japan than they are here, but we're all considering, what do our sanghas need? What do our communities need? How do we provide that, right? How do we connect with people? No temple ever has enough resources. I don't care where it is. I don't think there's ever a temple that would say it has enough resources. So what fundraising initiatives are happening within Sotoshu? How do we learn from that? How do we take that and get some ideas and some examples from that? What can we learn? It can be helpful to see what a denomination that's operating on the scale of Sotoshu, both historically, diachronically and synchronically, right? Historically and today. What are they creating? What are they trying? They're innovating in certain ways. What are they doing? What audiences are they talking to? And what subgroups of audiences are they talking to? What messaging is being put out there? How are things being positioned, right? How is Zazen being positioned, for instance? What practice activities are available? How are they doing that in a globally connected world, right? looking at something as culturally ancient and deeply embedded as calligraphy. And then how do we bring that forward and engage young people with it, right? What connections are we making to bring practice, to make practice available to people and encourage participation in ways that are not scary, right? In ways that are not intimidating, in ways that are fun and enjoyable and meaningful and relevant and useful. So again, I think it's really useful to see how Soto Zen functions in a culture where practice is not primarily about self-help, right? In a culture where people are born into the tradition in a certain kind of way. So nobody's going to look for that entirely as a means of solving my problems with procrastination or improving my marriage or lowering my stress. Yeah, that's in there. Are there companies, Zazen Kais, that are aimed at productivity? Yeah, and still. The circumstances there are different. This is not primarily about making me a better person, right? Self-help. It's not a special thing you only do on the weekend and then you don't think about it at any other time. It can be about how do you live every day, and not only if you're clergy or training in a training temple. How do you practice every day? How do you integrate practice every day into your life? Go to the temple, sometimes, but even when you're not at the temple, how are you integrating that into the way you sort of move through the world and live your life? So I think it's a helpful example of creating spiritual community. I tried to back up a little bit and go, it's interesting, all these little activities, not so little, all these many activities they're doing. What they're really doing, I think, is thinking about how do we create spiritual community. So there are certainly efforts to teach the Dharma. There are certainly encouragements for people to sit Zazen, to join a Zazen Kai, to read or copy sutras. It's not that those things aren't there. There are lots of resources, sermons, booklets, instructional videos, online sessions, right, conferences. You can do all that. Sotoshu makes all that available. There's certainly website information. There's a whole section on its website about somebody just died and I need to do a memorial. What do I do now? Right? All that information is there. That's important. That's core. How do you find the temple closest to you? They will help you, right? But there's also a lot of emphasis on simply making connections between people in temples, people in clergy, practitioners with other practitioners. There's a real effort to just connect the dots so that people are feeling like they're not isolated, not siloed. And there's a lot of reasons people can feel isolated. So I think they're looking carefully at what exactly is the society that's in front of us, and then how do we operate within that container, right? So in other words, how do we integrate the spiritual and the social, which I think is a really interesting intersection, and an intersection would be interesting to just sit in for a while. How do we integrate the spiritual and the social? So I think here recently we've seen for ourselves how that can be successful with our January Sanshin Salon, right? I heard a lot of positive comments about the opportunity that people had simply to get together with each other and do that around a topic which was an interesting practice topic. But mostly what I heard from people, it was great to see people I hadn't seen in a while and have a space and the time to have a meal together and catch up and do fellowship, right? That intersection turned out to be really interesting. So as Soto Zen develops in North America, I think we might pay a bit of attention to the scope of Sotoshu activities. It's not just the Zazen and the Dogen study, right? Those things are important. I'm not saying they're not, but there's so much more to the story. And there's so many more Dharma gates, and there's so many ways that we can expand those practice opportunities, right? I think some of the things that Sotoshu is doing can be helpful examples of ways to make sure we're not just sort of leaving our practice in the Zendo, right? How do we bring that into the rest of our lives for ourselves and other beings? So what all would you like to say or ask about the broad variety of Dharma gates that are out there, or that we might consider, or anything on your mind about that? Let me start with the people here, and then we'll go to the folks at home. Comments, questions, reflections? Please.
My, not to cast shade on anything you said, but my feeling in Japan was that a lot of the efforts that you described were very superficial. like one example was the environmental goals, which of course I'm very passionate about.
Right.
The extent of it that I saw was a little sign in front of the sinks in the bathroom saying, basically, please save water.
Yes.
And meanwhile, they had just constructed this $1 million building with no insulation where they're, just pumping heat out into the outdoors. So it seemed very surface level. And then at the same time, the kind of problem of engaging anyone under the age of 70 was very palpable. Anytime we had a public ceremony, you'd never see anyone that wasn't wrinkly.
Right.
Same with Baika, same with sutra copying.
Yep, the Goenka grandmothers.
Yeah. And, from my discussions with Reiho, who's, he's a priest who was at the temple where I practiced, who's from the US, but pretty deeply embedded in the kind of practice there. He said something like that Sotoshu knows that it's going to lose something like 75% of its revenue because of basically loss of interest in Buddhism from the younger generation over the next 20 years, and that they basically have no plan to really deal with that. And then at the same time, I feel like what we're doing here in the United States is something that they are not trying there. Just bringing Zazen to normal people. We had a Zazen Kai at Kotaiji, but there was no instruction given. There was no discussion before or after.
Right.
It was just kind of like...
No, it's just, it's usually Zazen and lunch.
Right. And it felt like such a missed opportunity knowing what we have here. And knowing what our lineage has sort of tried to do.
Right.
So I'm just kind of curious how you feel about all this.
Well, so that's why I said how much of this is performative, because you're not wrong about that, right? So I'm not here to say that everything they're doing is successful, or that enough resources are available to do those things thoroughly, because clearly not. And it's certainly true within the world, I'll just say within the world of Sotoshu, holding two truths at one time, they're really good at it. Don't do as I do as I say, right? So this is why I say I'm not here to be an apologist for them. And I'm interested in all the ways that at least they're thinking about how do we try to connect with people. We might make those connections differently. We might go about it differently. But I think it's really easy for us in North America to think Soto Zen is only about Zazen and Dogen. And there's just so much more to it than that. We think we understand it. I think if you go to North American practitioners, they would say, well, I completely understand the scope of the tradition. And then you take first-timers to Japan. I mean, you've seen first-timers in Japan. We've all been first-timers in Japan. And they look around and their eyes are like this. Oh, that's why we do. That's where it's like, then you realize you don't know what you don't know. So I want to put these things in front of us today mostly to sort of broaden our horizons. There's no question that Sotoshu has a lot of issues to resolve. And more than once as a Westerner, I was sort of taken aback by this whole two truths, what I'm calling it kind of a two truths thing. It's like, do as I say, not as I do. Well, because we find it even with robe regulations. You should never wear black, and yet, all of our robes are black. So the ability to hold these two versions of reality is sort of goes with the deal. So I think your experience is not unfamiliar. And we certainly can't say that everything is done completely under perfection. But I'm just really interested to see this sort of at least creative impulse that recognizes we can intersect Dharma and practice with things in the world and make that part of sort of everyday living and make it not a hobby and not a one-off. How do we integrate this? Now, yes, there's a certain amount of that that's self-serving because, as you say, there are not young people coming up. That's why temple succession is a big deal. Population is aging. Not so many new young people are being born into the world, there's a real threat to the continuation of the organization. So no wonder it's thrashing around a bit. I'm looking for ways to connect and ways to bring people in. And I mean, the fact that they have to run a dating agency is really interesting. You know, so that's why I'm putting that in front of us. I think we need to hold that, and we also need to hold the reality of how that stuff gets translated into activity. My impression with Zazenkais when I was there was that people who were coming came every month, already knew the score, knew how to sit. But what if somebody new wanted to come? Like, what would you do? But I think because we're not seeing new people coming in, that the sort of intake process doesn't arise because there isn't anybody new coming in. So it's a bit self-fulfilling, self-perpetuating in that way, right? What if somebody new wanted to show up? So from time to time, when Japanese clergy realize what's going on in, like an individual person realizes what's going on in North America, they're really surprised. You mean lay people are voluntarily coming to Zazen? They're doing Sesshin? What? They're studying Dogen? It's like, why would they do that, right? And then sometimes they become quite encouraged. You know, there's a certain group that says the future of this thing is in the West. So I hope it doesn't die in Japan, right? But it's really complicated. So the important thing I think you're pointing out is this is not simple. This is really complicated. And there's a lot of karma. And there's a lot of cultural stuff that we don't understand. And this is why I say they function in ways that we don't understand because this is not our culture. So somehow we have to sort of we have to do a reality check. And at the same time, I hope not get discouraged. Because there's lots of things, even if they don't work so well there, might they work here? Might we tweak them here? You know, certainly environmental is a big conversation in North America. There's lots of people that share your passion for how do we intersect Dharma with taking care of the environment. You know, maybe we're not going to do it the way they do it, but the fact that they've identified the environment as a thing, I think is interesting. Yeah, human rights, peace work, and the environment feel pretty familiar to us. We're not dealing with it the same way, but those are interesting intersections with Dharma. Yeah. So, the voice of reality.
I'd say one positive thing that I could add too is one of the monk bars in Tokyo is actually really pretty famous,
yeah.
I think. And Hennesis went there when he was studying abroad and said that it was his best Dharma experience.
Really?
Like, despite the fact that he was kind of going to various temples and trying to sort of seek out Dharma experiences. He said his best Dharma experience was at the monk bar.
Isn't that something? Well, and I get it, because if you as a tourist, you as you know, you can go into lots of temples in Japan, but you're not going there to sit zazen. You're not going there to hear a Dharma talk. You're going there probably to look at the artwork. There's usually a treasury full of artwork. You're going to look at the wonderful temple building and the beautiful Buddha statue. You're not necessarily going there to participate like we would do here. And I think Westerners get over there and they think, I can go to a weekly Dharma talk, or I can go to a morning zazen or something, and probably he had trouble finding a way to do that. So to go to the monk bar and actually talk to people was probably his opportunity. You know, unless you're there a long time and you know people, it can be hard to find those opportunities. Other comments, reflections?
I don't remember who it was. A Japanese-born Roshi said one time, years ago, that the day will come when Japan will have to reintroduce Buddhism into Japan, but this time from America.
Well, could be the pizza effect, right?
We have pizza. We give you pizza.
So maybe we are the refuge. Well, you know, that could be. And also, of course, we're going to practice Soto Zen in a North American way. So if we bring it back, we'd have to adapt it back. They would have to adapt it back, right?
So I'm not remembering the details, but Mizumi had some kind of a title. I don't remember what it was exactly, but it gave him some kind of jurisdiction over the various Soto temples in California, if not North America. And so when he died, that office became vacant. And Soto International, according to what I was told by Glassman, they approached him and said, okay, you're his main Dharma successor. We want you to have that office now. And Glassman said, oh, sure, but here's the thing. I don't want the Catholic model where Soto International gets to dictate.
Oh, Well, that's a North American problem, isn't it?
He said he preferred more of the Eastern Orthodox model, where it's more diffused, right? And so to give the American community, sanghas, more autonomy, more independence of Soto International. I guess we're going to get that by default anyway, for financial reasons, apparently, from what you tell me.
Well,
but Glassman's reaction was, well, fine, I'm not taking the office, and I hereby resign from Soto International. We'll just create our own club.
mm-hmm.
And we'll continue the tradition, but we'll continue the tradition in our own way.
Mm-hmm.
And his particular, I mean, all his Dharma successors are not registered with
Right.
Soto International. He's totally autonomous.
Yeah.
I remember when he told me this, well, that's fine and well, but no, I just got ordained. I want to stay connected.
Yeah.
And maybe something could be worked out. So with that as kind of a backdrop,
Yeah.
how much autonomy do we get? How much
Yeah.
flexibility do we have? What is it we're going to do to Americanize this? And how much is that going to be harmonious with the intentions, desires, and ambitions of Soto International?
Well, of course, you know you're talking to the president of the board of Soto Zen North America, right?
Well,
So,
that's the question.
all right. So I could spend an hour on that, and I won't bore you with it. Let me just say in general, the work we're doing to create a North American version of Sotoshu is done with Sotoshu's blessing and at Sotoshu's request. So that connection is very strong, will continue to be very strong. As a matter of fact, we can't really ever be completely separate because there's no way people could do as we say. There's no way that clergy could finish their credentialing without going to the head temples. And so it's, that there's always going to be at least that connection. But it's been very important for the people who are engaged in this project to maintain good relations and keep a good connection, right? So the reason to build a sister organization, to build a North American version, is in large part, I think, to help deal with the resource issue. If we can manage ourselves and we require less, that's easier for Sotoshu. There's no question that in doing that, we're going to practice and organize ourselves in a North American way, which is not at odds with Sotoshu, but we have particular things happening. We have particular cultural attributes and karmic stuff happening, and right. Even figuring out how do we reconcile wearing nyoho-e. This is not official vestments, right? I have suggested when we rewrite the vestment regulations for Soto Zen North America that we explicitly say these things are legitimate, right? Sotoshu can't do that. So there are ways I think that we can resolve some things because we're not Sotoshu, and yet at the same time we're very aware that we are also carrying, curating, promoting a particular legacy. And that we don't want to be completely separate. That's not the point of this thing. The point is how do we do Soto Zen in a North American way, which is really healthy and strong and vibrant and still connected with our roots.
Well, how about monastic training in America rather than having to go all the way to Japan?
So many people want that. That the urgency actually is rising. There was going to be an ongo in France. They're going to do a legitimate authorized ongo in France, which now because of resource issues they can't do. And the first thing I did was get a hold of my board and say, how soon can we start doing these ourselves? Because there are people who need the training and they can't get to Japan, or Japan can't offer these things in Europe or anywhere else because of resources. How can we help? So my big question frequently to Sotoshu is, how can we help? What are you unable to do that you really want to see us doing, and how can we take that on? It's going to take time, like 10, 15 years, not for the training, but I mean just to do a complete handoff. This is not a quick project. So since we're talking about this, let me just say, the guiding kyoshi of Soto Zen North America, our friend Ko and Franz, it's the equivalent of Akiba Sokan, right, on the Sotoshu side, is going to do a sort of a virtual visit with us. I want to say, is it the 23rd? Is that the actual date of March? We'll get it on the calendar. It's a Monday evening, virtually about an hour, so he can say some things about Zen in North America, Soto Zen in North America, and then take questions and discussion. So that's a great time to bring all of these questions, and I kind of think this group is going to have a good discussion because we're pretty well versed now in what's going on in ways that some sanghas haven't had the chance. So if you've got questions about this stuff, please come to that hour or so virtually and bring those in, because it's actually useful for him to hear what are people interested in, concerned about, talking about. Yeah. So Sanshin has I think, an important role to play in how this unfolds in North America, because I'm engaged in it, Doshin's engaged in it, Shoryu's engaged in it, right? We've actually got some skin in the game now, right? So we have a particular legacy, but that legacy functions within this larger Soto Zen tradition. So even though we have ancestors who've said, never join an organization, it'll kill your practice, they also didn't say, cut yourself off from the tradition. So I think we get to hold both of those things. We can do our dialect within the larger thing, which is why it's important, I think, to see the bigger picture. So those of us that go train in Japan, we come back with a broadened view in some ways, right? There you probably encountered things you didn't expect. If you're like me, you understood things at the end of that experience differently. I had ideas when I got there, which I quickly found were my own ideas, right? So we need that kind of broadening, which is why it's helpful to understand our particular dialect, our particular legacy, like really, really well, understand our practice and practice understanding, and then to see how that fits in the larger tradition, because we're not cut off from that. And I don't think anybody wants to be, at least not here. Too much for me. What would others like to say? Jeff, please.
Just a reflection, and I know it's my situation is coming from being on building committee, but the reflection has to do with listening to everything you were saying, and you started talking about the constriction, just of demographic, because of demographics of the organization and the sanghas and so forth. That and then we left there, but I would think that a really important dimension that should be in our discussions is scale.
Scale?
And because I believe that in North America at least, it's an issue.
So say some more about that.
How they, for stability and robustness and diversity in the sense of being able to respond to the changes in the world, scale matters. I mean, how large something is. If it's too large, it's unwieldy.
I see.
You get vision. If it's too small, it withers because you don't have the variability.
Right.
That's present to be responsive.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
And there's a my experience here at least is that we take pride in the compactness and the modesty of the size, but I think that we should really more versed in understanding scale.
So yes, so I think there's an interesting dance there between a smaller, intimate sangha with good connections between human beings. And I'm not saying that all sanghas have to be tiny. I'm saying if your sangha is a smaller sangha, because you can be very well focused, really know what you're doing, spend your resources wisely, concentrate on the things that either you're interested in or that you're good at. And also, because there's a partnership and you're part of something larger called Sotoshu or Soto Zen North America, you get to leverage that. So your sangha plus a bunch of other sanghas gets together. 14,000 Soto Zen temples and 1.7 million adherents can pick a lot of trash, right? So how do we serve our local communities, meet the needs of our very particular sanghas, and yet not lose sight of the fact that we are not alone in this thing, right? That there are other sister temples and other resources, and how do we, on some of the larger issues, I mean, one small temple is not going to solve, homelessness. If 6 temples regionally get together, what can we do? If it's a national thing, what can we do, right? So I think there's some intersecting there, where we can be focused enough to do the things that are important and central to us, and sort of not get distracted, and also partner with people to leverage resources to do something we can't do by ourselves. And I think that's why a denomination is important, right? So, as I say, there are particular legal requirements for a denomination, and one of those is you need to have a certain number of affiliated temples, and they need to have central, some kind of central direction. They need to be connected. They need to be receiving information or guidance or something centrally, right? Which means it's really different than a sort of membership association. It's a different animal. it functions differently, right? We've all agreed to abide by certain regulations and guidelines and whatever, and so we're all going to move together in a certain direction, and it can give us the kind of scale that maybe we couldn't have alone. So I understand what you're saying, and also, if it's not possible for whatever reason to be a huge local sangha, all is not lost, right? The fact that Sanshin is part of several larger national conversations is really useful because at least we have partners, at least for now. Yeah, I think you raised something really interesting. And I think it has to do with, when you look at the mission of the place, what is it we're trying to do in the world? And then what is the appropriate scale to do that thing? Yeah, that's an interesting piece of discernment.
I drove here this morning on 45 and went by the city church. And at the time we were getting ready to gather, I drove by this place and there must have been, I think this is realistic, hundreds of cars.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Parked in this lot.
Yes.
I almost ran off the road. I've seen it, but
Yes.
because I was thinking of these
Yes.
things. It's just unbelievable. And I find it off-putting and unwieldy and
It could be.
but these are issues of scale, and they're really
Right. Yeah.
in complex systems. It's just important.
Yeah, well, and systems is the thing, right? Because it is a system and it can be complicated. So do you have the resources you need to carry out the practice you want to do?
Exactly.
Practice has to match resources. Scope has to match resources, right? So do you have what you need to do the things that your mission says you're going to offer in the world, the kind of practice you want to offer in the world? And if not, how do you balance that? You either have to drop your scope or you increase your resources. You get, there's only two choices, man. So how are you going to do that, right? And if you can't do that yourself, how do you leverage what you have by partnering with somebody else? Yeah.
Well, Zen temples in Japan have big parking lots.
Some of them do. Some of them are tiny.
No.
Some of them are
But
really, really tiny.
There you're in a country with a majority Buddhist population, and
Right.
that's not the case here.
Right.
I doubt that we have more than 1%.
Yeah, and it depends on, and it's all self-reporting. So do you consider yourself a Buddhist or not? It's really hard to get those numbers here. Yeah, please.
Just a little bit off of what Jeff's saying, I wonder in Japan, is there more of this scale that allows for better infrastructure for families? Because I feel from my own experience, it's very hard for me to get here a lot of times just because I have a young child. And I don't really see that reflected in, I don't see anyone else like me here in the last 2 years I've been here.
Yeah.
And, you go to these churches with 100 cars in the lot. They have families
They have
because
childcare.
they have, Bible school. The kids there's activities and it's all integrated, so it's family friendly. And that's kind of
When
challenging.
one visits Greenbelt, that was one thing I was
Yes.
It was set up for families, and there was at one point before the full Dharma talk started, the kids went outside.
Well, we used to have
Maybe
a
this
visiting
is,
service next
yeah.
door.
Yeah.
You want to volunteer?
Well, and frankly, that was always the problem. It was Yuko and somebody was running the child. Her kids grew up and people move away, and so maintaining stability. And as I'm sure child care programs require a ton of resources. If you're really going to do it properly, and I would want to do it properly, so it's not a throwaway. I mean, that's a real commitment on the part of people. But I'll just say yes. So you can see, even from the things that I was talking about today, going to the temple is a family thing. Now, chances are those parents are not going to the family temple to sit 2 hours of zazen. And then what do you do with the kids, right? It's probably the flower festival, or it's probably there's a communal activity or something. But both supporting Sangha, Danka families and supporting temple families. There's initiatives about that. How do we support the family that's running the temple in addition to the families that come to the temple, right? But yes, there's kindergarten, there's activities, there's from small kids on up, because the point of this thing is it's not an individual, personal, spiritual quest, right? So if it's the day to bring your 3-year-olds, your 5-year-olds, and your 7-year-olds to the temple for their 3, 5, 7 ceremony, everybody goes. It's a family thing. in North America, I think we all began with the idea, I'm speculating here, I think we all began with the idea that Soto Zen was all about monks in monasteries, and that was the main structure, and that there was nothing else. And after you left the monastery, you went into a cave, right? You faced the wall for 9 years and you were Bodhidharma, because we just didn't know that there was all, we didn't know how that culture functioned, right? So I think we thought we have to build something ourselves because nothing like this exists in the tradition. So we have to do child care, and we have to build our own sort of youth education programs and all this stuff, thinking that somehow we had to make it up. And I think if you look back at the tradition, that's not what's going on. But somehow historically for Sanshin, we've not had young families. We've had individuals, mostly individual young men lately, and not so much in the way of families. But if you look at a place like Clouds and Water up in St. Paul, oh my goodness, I mean, half their catalog is family, children. I mean, they've really taken that on as a thing, and some sanghas do. They really take on youth programming as a thing. If there are people who are willing to lead it, that can happen. Our challenge here has been it's been really tough to get leadership around that, because it's a big commitment. It's a huge commitment. It's not just babysitting, right? It's got to be useful, meaningful activity, and in a way that young people can take it in, and it makes sense for them, and it's enjoyable for them, and not boring, and right. So you're not wrong in saying that's a gap, and I'm not promising we can fill it right away. But if you look at who's in the Zendo, you're not wrong in saying there aren't a lot of young families right now. And it could be that Sanshin decides that's a really key demographic. We really want to have young families. If we do that, we've got board members in the room, that takes resources. That's not just something I add on a calendar. That's going to take an initiative. We're going to have to devote resources to that. Because we want to make sure families think it's safe. We have qualified people leading, right? There's a whole thing around that. So yes, that's a gap. I agree with you. And if we want to continue to bring in young people so that when we all leave the physical realm, there's something going on here, that would be one way to do it. Other things in this room. Things at home. Folks at home, anything to say or ask today? Neil's got his hand up.
Yes, no, I appreciated hearing more about programming, especially back in Japan. And I think for me, the theme's about trying to engage really the person from birth to death. And having programs for kids really made sense. But I think most of the centers I've been involved in or temples have been relatively small, and so it feels like most of the people I practice with have often been converts. They weren't raised,
Absolutely.
with parents.
Yep.
And I think there's, personally, I found a benefit in that really, in this, if you think of the phrase that like one's chosen family, I think of this as like a chosen religion. But no, I think I didn't really look to raise my children in that way, like to inculcate those, like the specific religion. But certainly I was interested in, what are resources I could provide to my kids. And I've certainly had friends who have just been hungry for, ways to present the key concepts of Buddhism. And so, besides squabbling squashes, what else, can we offer? And I do think, though, that it is a challenge to say, like, if we are trying to nurture householder practice and lay practice, many people may come to Zen practice as teenagers, high school, college, and I'd hate to just accept that then, one has their young kids and they just check out for a couple decades. I think that's largely what I did. And and I think like thinking about ways to one, give practitioners resources to talk with their family and children is beneficial. Finding ways to help support families who want to continue practicing, in a deep way, I think is a useful goal. Yeah.
Well, there's, of course, in North America, there's a lot of demographic information we need to understand about that too, right? So even kids that were raised in nominally Buddhist practicing families here usually don't keep it up. So even if we raise them that way, it's no guarantee they carry on. And of course, we've also got the thing here where maybe one parent is a practitioner, the other one is not. And then that can be a source of, right, friction. How do we raise the kids? Or it may at least feel very important to one parent, not so important to the other parent, right? How do we do that? So we've got all of that because it's not, Zen is not sort of our broad culture because, as you say, a lot of people have chosen to be a part of the practice. So then I think we have to understand why some of these folks have chosen to practice. And again, it often will start out as this personal spiritual quest. I'm not doing this for my family, I'm doing this for me. So this is my me time. I'm going to leave the family and go and do my thing for me and then come back and yes, I'll be a better parent or I'll be a better spouse or whatever that is. But this is all about me. And we have not positioned, at least here, we've not positioned this thing as this is a family practice. This is the way we live as a family, right? And we could certainly do that. And so when you look at the practice vision and there's this piece called Sangha and society, eventually that stuff goes there. Now, it's going to take resources, what I say. It's going to take resources. So we need to have a plan for doing that. And if I feel a lot of upswell of energy about that, I'd be excited to do it. But we need people who are going to devote themselves to really figuring out that piece, families, young people, and as you say, people who choose this as a practice. There's a whole element of religious education that we have to do. When you walk in the door here for the first time, you probably don't know anything about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. We've got to start at the beginning and educate everybody, right? So it's not just religious education for the kids, it's religious education for everybody. So this thing becomes a project, right? So this is why I say it would be easy to just say, well, we'll toss off a little children's program onto the calendar. I don't think it's helpful. I would want to do that in a really thoughtful way. I would want to talk to people that do children's programs. What works for you? What should we put resources into? What did you learn? What mistakes did you make? Right? I mean, it's a project. It's like building a building, right? It's a big expansion of what we're doing. It's not impossible. If we want to do it, I'm happy to do it, but we need to go into it kind of understanding because this is positioning we've never really done here. Yeah. Somebody else has a hand up, and I can't see. Is it Abby? Yes.
Yes. I just, was that Rachel who made the remark about?
Yes.
Okay. And I must say that I've been concerned about that also, just as an onlooker, because you just don't see children.
Yeah.
However, and I do understand that making an infrastructure that contains young families is a very big undertaking. But I wonder, I don't know the demographics of Sanshin, other than what I see online.
What you see is what you get.
Okay. But I'm wondering if in the interim, if there are just a few families with children, if they might contact each other and form an informal support group that allows for a little more integration, and maybe that would open up into a larger concern eventually.
Well, that's possible, and I think that's probably the way these things begin, and that's probably largely what was going on. I mean, you were here during that time. My guess is it was a small group of families that wanted that engagement, and they kind of got together and said, I'll do this week, you do next week, and that's kind of how that functioned. So I'm just going to plant the seed. If people really feel strongly that this is the direction we want to go in, one of the sort of gateway events for children and families is typically Buddha's birthday. Now, we can't do it before April, please. Right? But if we really want to think about that, for instance, if you want to kick off a family and children's program, one way to do that is to do it around Buddha's birthday because kids like to pour the water and they like the flowers, and then there's other activities, at least in North America, there's other activities that sanghas will do for kids around Buddha's birthday because it's a happy time, people understand what a birthday is, right? So I'm just going to plant that seed if folks want to talk about that. But in the meantime, yes, and certainly if people want to form an informal support network around that, I certainly wouldn't have any objection. I think the real challenge is, again, people are coming to sit zazen. It's like, here I've got this dog. When I bring the dog to the temple, simply because we walk here, not because I want the dog at the temple, because this is the destination of the daily walk. What do I do with the dog when I'm sitting zazen? It's a lot like having a toddler, right? So we just have to think about how do we make a meaningful opportunity. And of course, for us right now, space is a problem. When we had the building next door, I think that's where folks were, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the young people were next door in the rented building. Well, we don't have that building anymore. And if they're up in the common room, goodness, we'd hear everything. And they can't be in the Zendo, so it's like, right? So it's a bigger issue than I'm going to put something in the calendar. There's a lot of, there needs to be a safe space, and it has to be appropriate and quiet and So I like your idea. I think that's probably how these things begin. Let's plant that seed, and if we hear a lot of energy around that, we can have some conversations. You've got board members in the room, so folks doing strategic thinking at the moment, so it's landing where it needs to land. Other folks at home, comments, questions? My goodness, we've had a long conversation today, which is good. That's fine. My purpose in sitting here is to spark conversation. Any last things we want to talk about today? Please, Corey.
I just wanted to comment about how listening to some of the concerns of the Soto Zen denomination over in Japan, how that kind of syncs up with, we have been, in my ethics class, we have been studying some ethical stances taken on by Christian people here in the United States. And regardless of what the talk is actually about, there's always this undercurrent of like talking about the decline of the church and like that happening due to like rising rates of atomization in society and like a breakdown of the family and such. And like it just interested me how much overlap there was between Soto Zen and even like the dominant religion here in the United States.
Although the reasoning is different, right? Because we're not dealing with the depopulation and the population mobility. Because the mobility thing is you're moving away from your family temple, right? So that temple loses your support.
That, actually, the mobility aspect was definitely talked about quite a bit. That where like this one person that we were listening to talked about how like even like a century ago, people didn't have as much mobility to like shop around for a church.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, so what I think is interesting in this whole thing about North American church, religion, demographics, rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not nuns. Rise of the nuns, right? I always thought this was a great phrase. Someday I'm going to, like, there ought to be a cartoon, Rise of the Nuns, right? What's interesting about that is that although people are moving out of sort of institutionalized religion, it's not people's need for some kind of spiritual practice doesn't seem to be declining. Maybe I'm moving out of my birth religion because I think it's superstitious, or I don't like what the clergy are doing, or I don't want to be part of a big institution, or whatever. But somehow the human impulse, the human need to say, what's my role in this world? What is there that's bigger than me? What happens after I die? How do I get to peace? Is not gone, right? So the frame around it, the container around it might be shifting, but the human need for that kind of practice doesn't go away. And I think that's why some people end up here. Maybe they want a different institution, or they want a different container or something. Because people are always going to be wrestling with ethical issues. How do I make a good decision? What is suffering about? What is compassion about? We're always going to deal with that. Maybe this is one way to frame those questions and work with those questions, right? So, yeah. Modern world is interesting. Things are hanging on from centuries ago, and yet, we have to adapt. Questions, comments this morning from anybody else? All right. Thanks for an interesting discussion. I hope we've planted some seeds that we'll continue to discuss informally, right, as we move along. Okay, thanks everybody.